So, this is me, Laura Perry. I am currently based at the Global Centre for Species Survival, which is in Indianapolis, perhaps quite randomly, but the point of the Global Centre is to support the IUCN SSC specialist groups with coordinating and the stuff that I do, which is behaviour change and focusing on designing interventions, social science techniques and capacity building for specialist groups that don't necessarily have the in-house capacity to do all of these complicated things we've been talking about here. So that's where I'm based now. I'm not about to talk about that because I submitted the abstract for this 3 years ago, so this is me doing my PhD, which was based in East Africa. And effectively, the question was, how do we use tools from social psychology to understand and influence people's livestock management decisions, which, as we all know, impacts their relationship with large carnivores. So this is on the way to Serengeti, I believe. So the first point, and not to be too pessimistic here, following on from other slightly possibly pessimistic talks saying behaviour change is hard, I'm going to repeat it. Behaviour change is really quite hard. I found a really interesting manuscript a couple of months ago describing all of the ways that behaviour change interventions can fail, which I think is interesting. So first of all, you're trying to do something, you're trying to move towards that white circle with the ring around it. That's where you're ending up. But if it's a white circle, that means that you did your intervention and nothing happened. There was no treatment effect. Could be worse, could be B, backfiring, which is where you move from where you are to begin with through to the red circle, where your intervention absolutely did not help and in fact hurt, and some unintended consequences. Option C, so you have your treatment, it does something good, but it also does something bad at the same time, so there is no real overall benefit. And if you're measuring perhaps biological indicators of success, then you may not see any good metric there. For example, one of the problems that I'm working on at the moment is to do with vulture poisoning and trainings around poisonings. So maybe the training means that people want to use poison less, but perhaps an unintended consequence is that certain people use poison more. You don't know. There could be one good benefit and one negative benefit, which might cancel out in terms of your biological response, which at the end of the day is what we're all looking for. You could have no treatment effect, but a positive side effect. I'm just trying to think of an example of this. So if anyone has a really good example where they tried to do something and it didn't work, but something else good happened, then please come and find me afterwards, because I would like to talk about that in future talks. But certainly possible, although I'm not sure I can find an example. Option E, which I'm sure you can't read this at the back, but I can read it, so I'm going to explain. When we're looking at measurement, and Diego touched on this a little bit, and anyone who's focusing on measuring behaviour change or changes in communities will say, it's very hard to measure the actual thing that you want to change. So you might see a case where if you're looking at indicators of attitude, for example, this is a common kind of problem, where maybe the attitude does change, but you don't see the change in the behaviour that you're looking for. And then option F, where you've got original state moving through to the green behaviour that you want, but maybe that's not the final state. Maybe something else changes, and that means that you get some ultimate negative consequence. And then the last two are basically changing conditions, which mean that while you may have planned a wonderful intervention, it may have gone excellently to begin with. Ultimately, consequences or the context in which that change is happening have changed, which means that you do not end up with your desired outcome. So there are lots of variants on this, and if you've seen Diego talk, not in this talk, but other talks, he uses a similar model. If you look at 5 different papers for modelling behaviour change, you'll get 5 different variants on this, but by and large, it looks like this. So, as Ewan said, your first step is figuring out what you want at the end of the day, and actually that can be quite hard to do. As we've talked about, different stakeholders might want very, very different outcomes. So figuring out collectively where you want to end up is definitely a necessary starting point. Then step 2, and depending how time goes, I might come back to this since Ewan has already explained the theory of planned behaviour and I didn't have time to fit that in. You might want to think about what steps will be effective in order to achieve the change that you're looking for. And whilst you can bring in research in any of the stages of this process, planning the change is a good place to find out the context, to figure out what might be effective, where those kind of, I like to refer to them as lifts might be, those things that might be more easy to change, what will be effective. Next, we're looking at mapping audiences. So people will call this stakeholder analysis, audience maps. There are a lot of different ways to describe this, but fundamentally we're talking about figuring out who your different communities are. People throw around, and particularly certain kinds of community, throw around the words general public, but if you're talking to marketers, if you're talking to people that focus on stakeholder analysis or target audience analysis, there's no such thing as the general public. This is a bit of a misnomer. It's not very helpful to think of your audiences as a big monolith. It's much more useful to break them down. Then you're looking at designing some messages. How do we communicate the change that we want to happen, whether that is a radio campaign, whether that is community drama, figuring out how we go towards seeing the intervention do what we want it to do. Next, we're figuring out, once we've decided what messages we want to promote, how we actually do it. So that might be choosing news media or print media or whatever that mechanism is. We need to figure out the practical implications, and then it's doing the thing once you've done all of this thinking, and then measuring it to hope that it worked. And the last step is obviously very important and often gets missed, which then becomes self-fulfilling, right? I think a lot of people in this room have mentioned or come against the problem that it's very difficult to know what you have to do to see behaviour change in the communities that you're working with. And this is a self-fulfilling problem because people don't measure the impact and then they don't publish, which means that nobody else can learn from whether it worked, whether it didn't work, what's going to happen next. So I'm very briefly going to talk you through point 3, which is mapping audiences, and an example of how I did that during my PhD, and then points 4 and 5, leaving the difficult bits out of this talk. So, mapping audiences. So this was work that, I'm just checking the time. Okay, this was work that was carried out in Kenya and Zimbabwe. Basically, you've got two big, very pastoral communities living around national parks, and they have very, very different perceptions within those communities, right? We've said the general public doesn't exist, so how do we break that down? So the point of this work was to think about, can we use survey tools to identify clusters of attitude or clusters of people within those populations who have very different attitudes, perceptions, behaviour towards predators? Because if you can identify those audience segments, then you can target interventions towards them. So it turns out that you can. By doing quite an extensive survey that focused on people's affective, so their emotional reaction to predators, to livestock depredation, and demographic factors, and a range of cognitive beliefs, you can do what is very similar to a principal components analysis, which I imagine a lot of you with more biology backgrounds are quite familiar with. So you can do that with social data, and that will give you nice little clusters which don't display very well in 2 dimensions, but believe me, they do display a little bit better in an n-dimensional space. So you can see that there are quite different groups within that audience who have different concerns, different realities, and need to be talked to in different ways. So we might say that maybe you can see that the mama with her cows, so we found very, very significant differences in female-headed households, as you might expect, and maybe the young Moran, you can see that those are very, very different groups. But it's not necessarily immediately obvious, intuitive, that the 2 families on the bottom are very different. So by mapping attitudes, we can see what those differences are, even if they're not immediately obvious. Okay, designing messages, part 2. This was work on normative beliefs in Kenya. So this is a community around the Chile Hills where they practice livestock management, but there is substantial variation in how people are managing their cattle. So some people in a community are doing all the things that the predator people, the conservation biologists, might want them to be doing, bringing their livestock into bomas overnight and sending guards, livestock guards, out with them during the day. And the other one is grazing different areas, because also like soil degradation is not good in the long term for the sustainability of that practice. But not everyone is doing them. So figuring out how we can encourage people to practice those behaviours is obviously has conservation value. So we used essentially a vignette approach where we would describe, based on qualitative interviews, very in-depth discussions with a range of community members, we could articulate what these behaviours were that varied and which ones were good or conservation compatible and which ones were less compatible with conservation. So, for example, I don't know if you can see from the back, but on the left we've got descriptions of very high standards, and on the right we've got descriptions of slightly lower standards. So for the high standard, on the grazing point, for example, we describe a person who is very careful about where his livestock grade. The herder takes them to the best pasture that they can access. By contrast, in the low standards description, we would say he lets his livestock graze wherever they want, and they can go wherever they want. So by constructing these different passages, saying this is what good livestock might be in this case, and what poorer livestock management might be in this case, it helps us to understand what those are, and those are then presented to interviewees as a comparison, and then immediately followed up with, how do you see yourself managing your livestock over the next month, year, whatever? And obviously this is all phrased in a way so it's not immediately patently obvious to the interviewee that that's what we're getting at. So by using this vignette approach, we can see that those norms, the good norm versus the slightly lower conservation standard norm, have a significant effect on how those participants intend to behave with their own livestock management. And taking the same approach, but instead looking at who we are messaging, we can see that the same thing is true. So if we say these young Morans are managing their livestock in this way and present that as a vignette, then people listen, they're interested. But if we say instead, these older community members are managing their livestock in this way, that has a far more significant influence on people's behaviour. So huge influence of what I was referring to as the referents, those social referents using the same vignette approach. So just to be extremely quick, conservation influences make a difference, but they might look more like that than the first option. So 3 take-home points very, very quickly. General public doesn't exist. There are quick and easy ways to break down an audience, and that can be much more meaningful in terms of targeting interventions to the people that might react to them in the way that you want. Point 2, norms can be really important for influencing behaviour, which you've heard from me, you've heard from a range of people now. And those norms are much more powerful if you choose the right people as those social reference. And last point is, this is really difficult, right? We've all said it's really difficult. Everyone through the conference has said it's difficult. And if your background is ecology, why would we expect you to know how to do it? But there are resources that exist, whether it's practitioners, whether it's people that have backgrounds in social science. The point is to engage the experts that know exactly how to do this and bring our knowledge alongside your knowledge, because it will be much more effective. The end.
Thank you very much, Laura. We have time for one question.
Just because no one else is asking.
Do it.
I'll shout. Did you... And I'm sorry I missed the first part of the session, but did you, in all this work that you've done, have you looked at the cost, effectiveness and feasibility of training local people to engage in some of these behaviour change behaviours or becoming influencers?
That is definitely a thing that I would recommend. I think I have not studied the cost effectiveness, and that would be very site specific. And I think, was it Simon Pooley said something very aptly the other day, that we can only provide guidance and recommendations because there's no transferability. Mm-hmm. So the fact that I can't recommend for one site or another, it's case specific, but my instinct would generally be that if you can identify key community members who are going to have influence and then encourage them to participate in whatever behaviours we're talking about, I would imagine that's a very cost-effective way to promote behaviours, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask